Okay, good morning, everybody. So how rodent behaviour influences a baiting plan. So just 30 minutes on this subject. So the contents I want to cover are foraging, rodent foraging and bait placement, permanent baiting, the social structure of an infestation, the hierarchy, odour signals that the rodents use, and then finally ending with neophobia and linking that with bait carriage and hoarding. So the first slide, when we talk about foraging, how far do they forage? So for brown rats, it's about 100 to 700 metres. Now, this is obviously just an average. We've got mice at 3 to 15 metres. And the impact this has on us is that this determines right, sorry, but it's jumping to slides without me asking it to. Sorry, let me go back up. I don't know why. So it didn't in my practice, sorry. So as rodent numbers grow, obviously this will spread, but we're just on about like a contained infestation. So that tells us when we see signs of activity or damage or anything like that, if we go, for example, for rats 100 metres away, we should really be looking at the areas of where they live in, their nests or their burrows. And the same for mice. And then also bear in mind, 3-dimensional, we need to be looking up and down, and particularly for mice, but also for rats as well. So when we're talking about foraging, I mean, it's typical just to put the bait around the edges, but for mice, they're sporadic feeders, irregular, and they like to explore. That's their natural behaviour, as we know. So this is a map that was kindly given to me by Adrian Mayer, and it shows, so they put grain all over the floor of a room, and put mouse in there. And where did it forage? Where did it eat? And everywhere where you see an X is where that mouse ate. Now here we have a nest and over there nest. And there was no preference for around the nest. There was no preference for around walls. And these black lines you see, they're batons. So just to kind of mark it up so it wasn't a massive open space. But there was no preference anywhere around the room. So we can see that this inquisitive, this exploring everywhere, eating from lots of different places, it's a survival mechanism for them. Because if one of these was a poison, then they've eaten at 20, 30 of them. So it reduces the risk. So for us, for pest controllers, does the risk assessment allow baiting other than around the edges of the room? And that's something that we can consider. And that would help in getting control quicker. So the completely opposite for rats, and we know that they're creatures of habit, and then we get all the telltale marks like we see here. So there's coming out of the burrow down there, it's under the building, across there and into the building there. So this is their route. So now we have ideal places for bait points. So we have one here and then the other side before they enter that building, and then maybe in the building. And this is their survival trait. If they did something yesterday and they survived, then they'll do it again and again. And so for rats, it's really easy. It's a lot easier to know where they're traveling because they leave such telltale signs. So again, we're looking at baiting along the pathways. So just kind of a summary of rodent foraging and bait point density. So rats are naturally neophobic, so they hate anything new. They do the same routine all the time. And once they've established their feeding behaviour, then it's very predictable, this creature's habit. When mice, it's been shown, are the opposite. They actually quite like new things, new food. And these are generalisations, and I know there are exceptions to both, and we'll come on to that later. Mice are naturally inquisitive, naturally neophilic. They can feed at 20 to 30 bait points per night. So if you look at the mouse is going to eat about 6 grams, that's like a third of a gram per bait point. It's a tiny, tiny amount. And that's distributing the risk. So therefore for mice, we need our bait points a lot tighter together to facilitate their natural behaviour. Where for rats, we've got this foraging of 100 metres, and they're going to do the same thing every time. So their bait points are 5 to 10 metres apart. And we'll come into a little bit more about location and density later, but definitely for BASF products, this is our standard label, and lots of others as well. So 1 to 2 metres, 5 to 10. And that is to facilitate their natural foraging behaviour. So when we're looking at placing bait for an effective baiting programme, obviously we start with the correct choice of bait. And there are many, and we'll come into a bit more pointers on what is the correct choice later. And the correct amount per bait point. If it says 200 grams on the label, then it's 200 grams. And the strategic placement, and this is what that's all about. And the nearer the bait is to the alternative food source that they're feeding on anyway, that they're finding palatable, the nearer the bait is to that, the more of a negative effect that has on bait consumption. And now this negative effect, it's less likely to occur when the food that the rodents are feeding on is changing all the time. So rubbish dumps is the typical example. But also we find that it's less likely in urban rats than it is in rural rats, because urban rats are more likely, the bins are getting emptied, there's traffic going on all the time, human traffic, all that type of thing. Now, ironically, for mice, this neophobia, this unusual behaviour, and I'll come on to that a bit later, in mice, this neophobia, that's more of an urban thing than a rural, so different behaviour. But rats, that's their natural behaviour to be neophobic. Mice, their natural is neophilic. And then, so what we want, if the nearer we get to the alternative food that they're living on anyway, has this negative effect, then obviously we want to place our bait so we intercept it. The nearer we can get to where they live with our bait, as opposed to the nearer we get to where they're feeding, the better we have for bait to take. And then also as a point, to reduce the risk of reinvasion, we need to cover as big areas as we can on our site. What we don't want is to clear one area and then they just reinvade from another. And then a kind of a good idea is also if we can undertake the infestation control when it's at its lowest point that we can, rather than, I mean, I've done infestations 2,500, 3,000 rats. I mean, and not just one or two. So it's a nightmare to be tackling something like that. It's an epic adventure type of thing. So again, that's what helps. So part of bait placement and strategy is looking at rats that are coming up from sewers. And this is a trial we did, and this is in Liverpool, block of student flats, and the drains were damaged. So we can see on both photographs where rats have come up from the damaged drain, and then right next to this it was in like a bit of a forecourt, is all the rubbish bins filled with all the overflowing fast food, and that's what the rats were coming out to eat. So, and we can see here on the left they've all dug up, and on the right they're coming out, and there's our bait box right next to where they're coming up, and they're also intercepting it before it gets to the rubbish bins. And I always use sand for my tracking. As it happens, the rats were throwing up sand anyway from under the paving flags, but we were putting fresh sand. And you can see it's just full of rat prints. So as the treatment was progressing, that allowed me to keep track of how many were actually coming out of the sewer. So migration from sewers to above ground, it can happen when there's been flooding in the sewers. I mean, we've seen such a lot of flooding or disturbance or damage. So disturbance can be building, humans, damage. The rodents may actually have caused the damage themselves in the first place. And from that, we can get a new infestation above ground, or as the case in our trial, they were just coming up and down every day. They didn't actually set up the infestation they were just happy to come up every day. And there's been work that's shown in some urban areas, 60 to 70% of the infestations are actually related to sewer and drainage damage. Now, another thing that sometimes rodents can migrate seasonally, so returning to the sewers that are offering optimum food, shelter, warmth, no predators when we have harsher winters. So the implications for us for rodent control is when rodent activity is persistent and you've done your comprehensive baiting program, then maybe there's a damaged sewer system. It might not be on your property, it might be on the next property or the one next to it. And this is providing an ongoing source of the rodents. And then obviously when the treatment's finished, try and push for them sewers to be mended, the drainage to be mended. So that's for that. So another one is burrow baiting. So read the label, which baits allow burrow baiting. And burrows, brown rats like to live in burrows. I mean, they're called, it's fancy term, negative geotropy. It means they like to go down. But it doesn't mean they can't climb and they can't live in lofts. It's just their natural behaviour. And we know that the burrows, they offer food and shelter and somewhere to rear the young and protect from predators and store food if need be. So we can see we have the burrows here on the left in like an embankment, really, and then inside the burrow. Now, when I'm burrow baiting, I use securable blocks, either soft or hard, normally and hard blocks, and I put them on a wire and push that down the hole. Now, I've not pushed them down the hole here so that you can actually see in the photograph. So this is 2 stone blocks, and then I tie it to something. So this case is a rock. And that means I can pull it out every time I visit and see is the bait been taken. And at the end of the treatment, I can get the bait back and dispose of it. But what you mustn't do in all of this is block the hole. If you block the hole with the bait, then that just causes neophobia. They can't get out. This is the preferred in and out. We found that out from the survey. And if we block that, then they'll just totally ignore the bait and they'll make a new exit right next to it. And then that's kind of just a waste of everything then. So that's how we're going to that's how I tackle this. So burrow baiting, it reduces the competition for the food. So it's like Meals on Wheels, isn't it? We're taking it to the door. We're competing. So we have no negative impact of the alternative food. They don't need to forage. So they feel safer. They're not at risk for non-targets and other rats and mice. So that's our implication for baiting in burrows. So an ideal place to bait. So just want to mention now about permanent baiting. So if a treatment has to go on for longer than 35 days, which is what our label says, then that's, for some reason, maybe you've had an infestation from your next door neighbour in mid-treatment or something's happened, then that's long-term baiting. When you do a risk assessment and carry on past your 35 days, this is permanent baiting, and that's completely different. So normally when we have an integrated pest management strategy that's to help prevent infestation. And then we come on and then we control the infestation when it's established. And sometimes that might be with rodenticide baits. But when we actually use bait to prevent rather than control, that's permanent baiting. And crew have the guidelines on it and when you can use it and how you can use it. So it has to be when the infestation is an unacceptable risk to human or animal health, and there's a high risk of reinvasion. And alternatives just haven't proven to work like IPM. And we obviously need to have the appropriate risk measures in place. So that's permanent baiting. And it could be that on a site, the permanent baiting is just in the high risk areas. So typical what you'd say would be that if the shutter doors are always open and next door is a rubbish tip or whatever, and they're just constantly coming in, then maybe by the doors for rats, things like that. So and that would be on your site survey and risk assessments. That's permanent baiting. But if you need to permanent bait as part of your strategy and your plan, then obviously you have to look at the labels. So this is just by active and which can and which can't you permanent bait. So pumatetralal, no. Difenicum and bromadiolone, yes. some but not all. So, and that's just the manufacturer's choice, what they applied for. So read the label, not all diphenicum and not all bromadiolone baits are say suitable for permanent baiting. Cholecalciferol, so that's the cilantro bait that Helen will talk about, yes. And then the most potent ones, Flacuma difecum, diphenthylone, no. And that's a risk management strategy. But no matter which you choose, take into account, do you have resistance in your area and what do you have resistance to? So that's permanent baiting. So now I just want to talk a bit about the social structure. So rats are in hierarchies and mice. So we have our dominance, then subdominance, and then non-dominance. Now the non-dominance might be in another one or two waves. So it's like any society. You have your generals, your lieutenants, and your foot soldiers. And when we control this infestation, now you've probably seen this graph a few times. We have it in the pulse baiting PowerPoint, in the cilantro training, but the principle's the same. You kill the dominants. They eat the bait first. They're the bosses. And then when they go to the burrows or nests because they feel the effects, so for anticoagulants, that's kind of anywhere between 3, 4, 5 days. Then for cilantro and for cholecalciferol, it's shorter. Then the subdominants feed. And then after they go to the burrows, then we have the next wave. So to help counteract this going through the waves of if you have sufficient bait points in the first place, so that, say, for example, you have 5 bait points and 50 rats, then the dominants can claim them 5 bait points. If you have 50 rats and 10 bait points, then there's enough for the 5 dominants to claim and enough, there's 5 more for subdominants. So that's why we have more bait points than that. And it's to get through the infestation as quick as possible. And that's what we want, to reduce the risk of damage, contamination, all those things. So we need the bait points, the adequate bait points for the size of the infestation. And that gets us through this hierarchy. And then for the baiting technique, so we have this pulse baiting, we have this baiting going through the waves, if you like, and then we have different ways of baiting regime. So we have the surplus baiting, and that's for all first generations. And I talked about this when I did the pulse baiting, so I've just literally one slide. And the second generations, bromadiolone, diphenicum, and diphenthylone. We have pulse baiting, which is diphenicum and flucumafen. And don't forget, they're not for outside, and neither is diphenthylone. And then we have the speed baiting, which Helen, I'll probably talk about in the, but anyway, it's on our website. So implications for rodent control. Use the active and the amount as what it says on the label. Visit and replenish. It's no point if you're not going to replenish as per the label instructions. You've got your permanent baiting considerations if you need to be doing that, and your resistance status, and like I said, pick the baiting regime that suits how you can visit. So the next thing I want to talk about is odours and odour signals. So these are urine pillars, which are we see with mice sometimes. Very rare with rats. The one on the right is a rat, and it was a flour mill. And underneath that, I hope you can see, it was just so we can see hundreds and hundreds of rat droppings. Now, these urine pillars, they're a combination of urine, dirt from and grease from the rodent themselves, and then they keep depositing the urine and keep then that keeps adding to it, and it builds and builds and builds. And this is where now this contributes now. This is them signaling to one another. Social status, where the food is, and where group status. And they're really, really important for mice and for rats. And it's how they signal to one another. And this has helped to kind of contribute to their success. The fact that they can signal to one another, danger, safety, food choice, things like that. This is all part of the communication. And how they do it, these urine pillars, they deposit like a semiochemical. And a semiochemical is just something that they use to communicate that will alter the behaviour of another rat or mouse. So they have these semiochemicals, and then they get wrapped in like a protein to protect it. And what this does it makes it very hardy and kind of very durable. So it's not like a perfume where you spray it and it'll be gone. These will stay quite substantially. But what they tell us is that when you have these types of urinary pillars, that your infestation is really large and well established. This hasn't happened overnight. It hasn't happened in a week. It hasn't probably even happened in a month. So when you have these types of urinary pillars, whether it's mice or rats, you know you have a large and well-established colony. And they'll tell you where they're traveling across. So it does give us some indication of where we should be baiting. Here, like I said, this was a food warehouse. So they're going around the edges of that until they find the way in. And there's spilt food everywhere. And we can see that's around the edges of a sack and they have food and they've got into that. So it does tell us where we can bait. So that's sort of very important. And like I say, communication, it alters the behaviour of others and it helps provide us with the location. So the final subject, and there's quite a few slides on this, is neophobia, carriage and hoarding. So we've already said that rats are naturally neophobic, serve the survival mechanism. So this can be to newly placed rodent bait boxes, rodent bait, monitoring devices, anything. And the effect it has is they completely ignore it. My worst one was 15 weeks before they went in the bait box. And then that's when I put the bait in. Luckily, I could do that. We could keep check every once a week. Else otherwise, we'd have had the bait out in the environment for 15 weeks. Nothing would have happened. And you blame it on the bait. And it wasn't. It was just the bait boxes. They just didn't. These particularly like enhanced neophobia. To the bait, the neophobic reaction is they take a small bite and go away and then come back. Now, they could have come back 5, 10, 15 minutes, an hour later or the next day. That all depends on the kind of personality and the extent of their neophobia. Obviously, the more an infestation is disturbed on a day-to-day, so more like urban or where bins are, then the less neophobic they are. And then in Hampshire and Berkshire, they're what are called highly neophobic rats and mice. And this is called enhanced. And these actually might be genetic based. But this neophobia can also be passed on from mother to offspring. It's been shown that if you place bait in vegetation where it's undercover, then that helps reduce the kind of neophobic effect to the bait boxes and helps with bait consumption because they feel more secure. This is just a quick look at the slides to show. Remember, I was saying about where they took 15 weeks. So they totally avoid it. Then the next step is they run over it. It was quite a muddy site, so I didn't need anything to track what they were doing. The mud told me, the paw prints running over the bait boxes. They actually had the cheek to bury my bait boxes, so that's one of them more or less buried. And then after 15 weeks, it was like a button was pressed and they started accepting the bait boxes. But a mammoth job. And then on the right-hand side, this was in a warehouse where there was no mud, it's inside, it was rats again. So I just put sand in there. And the minute I started seeing sand prints in the sand, then I put the bait in. And they quite like the sand because it's a gritty thing for them to be walking on. So to help reduce neophobia, you've got acclimatization here, then use some type of monitoring to see if they're using the boxes. So I use sand. There's monitoring tracking doses that are available. There's monitoring bait that's out there, blank monitoring bait. So these are all kind of options if you want to reduce the amount of time. Make sure the bait's only down when it needs to be effective. Behavioural resistance. So this is with mice, and this is, again, urban now. So we know mice are naturally neophilic, not like new things, like exploring. Behaviour resistant mice, they can't digest carbohydrates. It's genetic, they can't. It causes them pain and suffering. So I think they've then, because they have to be so careful in their day-to-day lives of what they eat, they've become really neophobic. So they avoid new things, new food. So they avoid bait boxes, they avoid baits. So these are a real problem in city areas. And and it's an abnormal behaviour. So for us, acclimatising bait boxes, can you use covered and protected? Can you use a bait box and put it under in it like under the kick plate in the kitchen and secure it? Can you put it in the loft out of the way where there's no non-targets? And then traps, although it's been shown that they are neophobic to the traps as well, and sometimes even to sticky boards, they can be neophobic. And then limiting the alternative feed and sanitation. We had a colony of these in the lab, and we found that the simple act of cleaning them out could cause such stress to them that it would affect their breeding. And the odd 1 or 2, so 1 or 2%, would actually die due to the stress of us just cleaning them out. So maybe environmental integrated pest management, while it probably only kill 1 or 2, it might impact their breeding. The next is carriage. So rodents want to feel safe where they eat, and the place they feel the safest is in their nest. So it's natural behaviour to want to take it away. So we want to stop that. We don't want them carrying away bait and dropping it on the ground for non-targets to pick up. So that's where, if there's a risk on your site of transportation of carriage, then the bait must be secured. So we have bait boxes that we all know. And for covered and protected bait trays, I still secure my bait. I just make a hole in the tray with a pen and wire everything on and wire it to there. And that's what I use. Everything can be carried away, apart from the only thing they found that they can't is basically flour. Everything else, it's cereal grains that they can carry away. It's more common in subdominants, which you'd expect, because they're more frightened of another rat kind of attacking them when they're in the bait boxes. And like I say, we don't want it dropped. So reduce the risk with bait boxes with secured bait or bait trays with secured bait. And studies have shown that the bigger the bait box, the better, because the rats will group feed 2 or 3 at a time, and one will protect the other while the other feeds the small family groups. The next is hoarding. So this is kind of linked to carriage, but here they're not carrying it away to eat it, they're carrying it away to store it for a rainy day. That's the big difference here. And this increases as they approach adulthood. It's more common, as you could think, in pregnant and lactating females. So they are storing for a rainy day. And they can store, quite common, they don't store it in the nest. The worst one I had some bad luck on my trials, haven't I, was we were doing a research project, research bait, and we had 2.5 kilos of bait gone, and we hadn't really impacted the infestation as it should have done. So we called a halt to it, we stopped it, we're removing all the bait, let's take it back to the labs, let's see what's gone wrong, what's happened. And there was 2.5 kilos of bait hidden between pallets, and this was rats. So for me, that was teamwork. There's one rat hasn't done that, but that was multiple bait points gathered together into one massive. So the thing is about that, if this wasn't a research study, we'd have thought that the bait wasn't effective because we had 2.5 kilos gone. Why haven't we killed rats? So again, it masks what's actually going on in the infestation. So again, to reduce for us, we're securing bait in secured bait boxes. And then, so that's the last slide that I have. But what I just want to end by just saying that knowing rodent behaviour, it's complex, and knowledge of this behaviour and what anomalies and how your infestation might be different from this, but knowing their standard behaviour, then it's an important tool in the pest controllers toolkit. Okay, thank you very much.
Perfect, thanks Sharon. We seem to have lost Natalie.
Oh right,
briefly, so I'm just going to. Don't worry. No, don't worry. We've got a few questions for you to go through before we pass over to Kieran. So one of the questions is, do you know how long the scent marks that rats leave last? It says, I had a farm that had rats living down in an old grain tunnel inside a shed, climbing up and down a wall-mounted ladder. Once I'd cleared the rats, the farmer removed ladders and filled the shaft and floor with hardcore. 2 years later was digging at the spot where the shaft was. That was only the spot in the shed that had burrowing activity, with the rest of the hardcore untouched.
Months and months. I mean, nobody's actually, it's a good study to look at. Nobody's looked at that, but you are looking at months and months. So that's something I didn't say is definitely when you finish your rodent control and then scrub it, do you know what I mean, and bleach it and try and mask it. But they're very clever, them urinary pillars, and and like I said, they're protected with that protein. So months and months and months they can last.
Okay. And then another one that's on here is if we should block the burrows because of neophobia, how should we make it safe?
So I mean, what I meant with don't block is don't block with the bait. So if you want to block the burrows after you've burrow baited, then just cover it with something. I don't like I carry straw around, but straw or something like that. But you push the bait down. Mine was in view, so you could see what I was doing. But you just push the bait down. But what you've got to be able to see in so that they can see out. Do you know what I mean? And that's how you're offering them the bait without making them feeling uncomfortable in their own home. So look at the size of the bait and the bait point sizes to make sure that happens. They've got to be able to still get in and out past your bait.
Yeah. And then the next one is, what products do you have for permanent baiting?
Okay, so for us, for our project is difenicum. So we have our difenicum block for permanent baiting. I'm not sure about difenicum block is the one we have. Storm is our other one, which isn't allowed because it's on the no-no list. Difenicum is the one that we have. But you like I say, read the label because not all difenicums will be, but ours does say permanent baiting.
Brilliant. And then one more, with a mating pair of rats, do the males stay around to help the females raise the little ones?
I nearly swore then. No. I mean, in fact, quite the opposite. So the male rat wants to mate with as many as possible. And that's what he does. So that's why it's really important to get to kind of the last one or two. So no, he doesn't. And the complete opposite, a new male into an infestation, he can start by killing the litters from the other females that have got litters so that he can then impregnate them, because they can get pregnant on the first day and start all over again. So he has no paternal instincts at all.
Brilliant. And then we have one last question on here. It says a naive question, but is rodent behaviour part of the RSPH level 2? And if not, should it be, in your opinion?
I think, I don't know if it is, sorry, I don't know if it is, I can't remember, but yes, I think so, because it takes so much of what we do. It's years and years ago, we used to have it had a thing, think rat, do you know what I mean? And it's all part of like, know your enemy, do you know what I mean? It's you have to know what you're up against, so strategically, because they are clever, do you know what I mean? And they are keeping up to us with what we're doing, so yes, I think so.
And the last one is just a comment to say thank you so much info, and they've learned lots of new things today.
Okay, thank you. So can I just say as well, I mean, I don't even say at the end, but any other questions, please contact me, Helen, yourselves, and we can answer anything else via email. That's fine. I'm fine with that.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Sharon.
Thank you. Okay.